everyone, I'm Meredith Martinez, and I am going to give a summary presentation of the 1919 Boston Molasses Flood. The story really starts in 1915. World War I was going on, and the United States was not part of the war. However, companies were benefiting from lucrative war contracts, sending needed supplies to the Allies overseas. One of those companies was the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, or USIA. They were using fermented molasses to create munitions such as smokeless gunpowder and explosives to send overseas. They were seeing profits like they had never seen before through the war contracts, and they wanted to capitalize on that as much as possible while they could. So one way that they could do that was to create more storage tanks so that they didn't have to pay a middleman to receive and store molasses for them. They decided that they would build a very large molasses tank capable of holding almost 2.5 million gallons of molasses right on Boston's north end. It was at a harbor. It had easy access to railways. It was a very good spot for USIA because ships could bring in molasses, they could load it, they could ship it on rail cars. It was a good location. It was not so great for the people who lived there. There was a big community made up mostly of Italian immigrants. Most of them were not citizens, and there was a lot of animosity towards Italian immigrants at the time, so they didn't really have any political power or voice in the community. So there was really no resistance to USIA building this very large 50-foot tank, and that's just the actual storage part of the tank. Was 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter. The amount, I believe I gave you the amount in gallons, that translates to about 26 million pounds of molasses. So this was a very substantial tank to build at a residential neighborhood. There was a playground. It was also a busy area for marketing and commerce. So USIA started building the tank. They were on a tight schedule because a molasses shipment was coming in, and if they weren't finished with the tank by the time the molasses shipment got there, they would lose money. The molasses would either be dumped or it would be given to somebody else. So they hired Hammond Iron Works to construct the tank, and there's evidence through letters that it was a rush job at the request of USIA. USIA assigned a single person, Arthur Gell, to oversee the project and make all the determinations, sign off on the specifications and everything. This was a problem for a lot of reasons, the biggest of which is that Arthur did not have any background in architecture, engineering, building, construction. His background was in finance, accounting. He hired this company and agreed to the plans they gave without having any kind of expert look at them and verify them, just based on their reputation. You know, this is what they do. They're a building company. They must know what they're doing. This was also problematic because the company went with Arthur's recommendation of a safety factor, which determines how much pressure the receptacle can take, how much pressure could be applied to the tank. And he arbitrarily assigned it a 3, just because, and he testified to this later, just because he had heard other people who built tanks say that their safety factor was 3, so he figured it would be sufficient. So the job was rushed. In fact, they worked up until the very day that the molasses shipment came in. And because they worked up until the very day, there wasn't time for safety testing. It was a really big tank. It would take a long time to fill it with water to check for leaks. Arthur was concerned that it would take days or weeks. And in addition, because it would take so much water to fill it, he was concerned about the cost. He testified later that he determined it was an unnecessary cost. So they filled it with 6 inches of water, 50-foot tank, 6 inches of water, and said, it's good, let's go. So they began filling it. It leaked from the beginning. It made horrible sounds. Employees reported this. One particular employee, Isaac Gonzalez, was so concerned that sometimes he slept at the tank so that he would be there to call if there was a disaster. And for years, it leaked so much that kids would fill their pails at the base of the tank with molasses. People reported hearing groaning. In response to the complaints, USIA, well, first of all, Arthur Gell was not inclined to accept the complaints, and he actually made Isaac Gonzalez worry about his job when he took his complaints to him. And eventually Isaac Gonzalez just had to leave because he couldn't handle the stress. But then when people that they were a little more concerned about started complaining, like businessmen in the area, USIA decided to paint the tank. It was gray. They painted it a rust brown color to match the molasses so that people couldn't see it leaking. They did recalk it a couple times, but it didn't work. They also put sand at the base of the tank to contain the molasses. And this went on like this for years. So in 1919, the war was starting to wind down, and USIA wasn't seeing as many profits, but they could still make a lot of profits from distilling the alcohol for rum. There was a problem, though. Prohibition was about to go into effect. 35 states had supported the 18th Amendment for alcohol prohibition, and several states were racing to be the 36th, which would be 3/4, and that would be a done deal. Once the 36 states signed on, there would be a year-long window that alcohol could be produced and sold, and then it would be banned in the United States. This meant that at the beginning of 1919, USIA had to produce as much molasses and as much alcohol as possible, because any day a year-long countdown was going to start, and at the end of that, their business would be done. So they filled the molasses tank as full as they could, and on January 12th, they got a large shipment of molasses that took an entire day into the 13th to fill. It was 600,000 gallons. And people heard the groaning from the tank. The hot molasses went in and mixed with the cold molasses. It produced gas. And on the 15th, after a couple days of the tank in that condition, it ruptured. And a wave of molasses over 30 feet tall and moving over 30 miles per hour burst out of the tank and went in all directions. It killed 21 people and injured 120 more. And crushed buildings, damaged property. It took months to find all the victims. During that time, others succumbed to their injury and infection. Things were sticky for a long time. People were injured in ways that they could no longer work. The elevated railroad was destroyed. USIA's immediate response was that an anarchist blew up the tank. This was not unheard of, because companies who were contributing to the war were being attacked, and there were bombings in Boston. However, there was no indication that that had been the case here. A large class action lawsuit was filed. There were 119 complaints against USIA, and they went to trial. Both sides had testimony. One side was showing how they had obviously not done what they needed to. They rushed construction. They didn't do safety tests. They ignored and covered up complaints. And the other side was just focused on, it was an anarchist. They were really taking advantage of the fear of the time. USIA paid all but one of their witnesses, and the other side did not. There were over 900 witnesses, thousands of pages of testimony, and ultimately it was determined that USIA was at fault. This was a significant determination to make because at the time, big business was really appreciated in the United States, and it was really frowned upon for there to be any kind of government regulation that would inhibit businesses. And so that was a real turning point. And, the case, it matters for a lot of reasons. People died, and we rely on people who build and maintain structures, buildings or other large structures, bridges. We rely on these people to keep us safe. And from this case, architects and engineers started to have to sign their plans, which added accountability. Different building departments started requiring different permits, which USIA had managed to sidestep getting a building permit in the first place by just classifying their plan as a receptacle and not a building. So they closed some loopholes. They started requiring engineers to get certifications for their projects. They just really changed some of the laws that now keep us safe, whereas we were relying on just people being good and doing the right thing and knowing what they're doing, and they added some external controls there in the form of regulations. Also, it impacted that Italian immigrant community. They probably felt victimized. Their community was taken advantage of and destroyed, and they didn't have a voice. A lot of Italian immigrants became citizens in the 1920s and 1930s following the flood. And, a lot of things could have been done differently. We can see that somebody should have been supervising Arthur. There should have been a chain of command where they could go above Arthur. There shouldn't have been a culture of covering up problems for the sake of, everything being okay and just making as much profit as possible. They should have built in a better place. There should have been yearly inspections, the way that we inspect bridges now. There were a lot of concerns, and we can learn a lot from the case. It could have gone very differently if there were ethical considerations at the time. Thank you.